worked as charge nurse in St. Catherine's ICU for 14 years. An emergency response becomes automatic after that length of service. When code blue alarms sound, you respond without conscious thought. Muscle memory developed through countless critical situations where seconds determine patient outcomes. So when the ICU alarm system activated at 2:17 a.m. on November 3rd, 3 weeks after the ward had been officially closed, I found myself running toward a medical emergency that couldn't exist in a facility that no longer housed patients. The ICU had been the final ward to close during St. Catherine's systematic shutdown. Our last patient, Mr. Henderson, had been transferred to Methodist General on October 15th, and I had personally overseen the decommissioning process. All medical equipment was relocated, all medications were transferred to appropriate facilities, and all monitoring systems were disconnected according to protocol. The ward was empty, sealed, and scheduled for demolition preparation. But the code blue alarm was unmistakable. The rapid, insistent tone that indicated a patient in respiratory or cardiac arrest requiring immediate intervention. The sound was coming from ICU Room 7, where we had treated hundreds of critical patients over the years. My training overrode my rational knowledge that no patients remained in the building, and I responded according to 14 years of emergency protocols. I reached the ICU entrance within 90 seconds of the initial alarm, but the automatic doors didn't open. The card reader showed my credentials were still valid, but the mechanical systems weren't responding to authorization. Through the glass doors, I could see the emergency call lights illuminated throughout the ward, not just room 7, but every patient room, indicating multiple simultaneous code blue situations that would have been impossible to manage even with full staffing. The facilities manager arrived with override keys, explaining that the alarm system was scheduled for disconnection, but had apparently malfunctioned before the shutdown process was complete. We entered the ICU together, expecting to find a simple electrical problem that was triggering false alarms. Instead, we discovered a ward that appeared to be in full emergency operation despite containing no patients or medical equipment. Every room's emergency lighting was activated, creating the harsh, bright illumination used during critical care procedures. The call buttons were engaged in each room, indicating patients requesting immediate assistance. The central monitoring station showed vital sign displays for 12 different individuals, with cardiac rhythms, blood pressure readings, and respiratory rates that suggested multiple patients in severe distress. But the rooms were empty. No patients, no medical equipment, no staff responding to the emergency calls. Just the persistent alarms, the flashing lights, and the monitoring displays showing critical vital signs for individuals who weren't present. The code blue alarm continued sounding, creating the acoustic environment of a massive medical emergency occurring in empty rooms. I approached the central monitoring station to attempt shutting down the alarm system, but the displays showed detailed patient information that hadn't been stored in the ICU's database for months. Room 7 indicated patient Robert Martinez, age 64, V-fib arrest, requires immediate defibrillation. Room 3 showed patient Sarah Thompson, age 58, respiratory failure, intubation needed. Each room displayed specific medical emergencies requiring immediate intervention. The vital sign monitors were generating real-time data despite being disconnected from any patients. Heart rates fluctuated between normal ranges and dangerous arrhythmias. Blood pressure readings showed the patterns typical of cardiac events. Respiratory monitors indicated breathing difficulties that would require mechanical ventilation. The equipment was providing critical patient information for individuals who existed only within the monitoring system's memory. I attempted to respond to the emergencies according to established protocols, even though no patients were present. Moving from room to room, I checked locations where critical patients would be positioned, looking for medical situations that the monitoring equipment insisted were occurring. The call lights continued flashing, the alarms kept sounding, but no patients required the emergency interventions that the systems were desperately requesting. Other staff members began arriving in response to the prolonged code blue alarm. Dr. Peterson, who had transferred to Methodist General weeks earlier, appeared in scrubs and began coordinating emergency procedures. Nurse Williams started checking equipment that wasn't present, and respiratory therapist Johnson wheeled in ventilators that had been relocated to other facilities. Everyone was responding to a medical emergency that felt completely real despite the obvious absence of patients requiring care. We worked together for over an hour, following standard code blue protocols for the phantom patients that the monitoring systems were tracking. Dr. Peterson called out medication. Orders for drugs we didn't have to treat conditions we couldn't observe. Nurse Williams documented vital signs from monitors that showed critical readings for empty beds. I coordinated care activities for 12 simultaneous emergencies that existed only within the ICU's institutional memory. The most disturbing aspect was how natural the response felt. Despite knowing the ward was empty, we fell into familiar emergency routines developed through years of critical care experience. The muscle memory of saving lives took precedence over the logical impossibility of the situation. We were providing emergency medical care to patients who needed our expertise, even though those patients existed only in the electronic systems that had monitored them during previous medical crises. The code blue alarm finally stopped at 4:23 a.m. after running continuously for over 2 hours. The emergency lights dimmed to normal levels, the call buttons disengaged, and the vital sign monitors returned to standby mode. The ICU became quiet and empty again, showing no evidence of the massive medical emergency that had required our immediate attention for most of the night. Dr. Peterson, Nurse Williams, and respiratory therapist Johnson left without comment, appearing confused about why they were in the building. When I attempted to discuss the evening's events with them later, they had no memory of responding to code blue alarms or participating in emergency procedures. They remembered being at home during the early morning hours, not coordinating critical care in a closed hospital ward. I submitted an incident report describing the alarm malfunction and the automated response by former staff members, but the documentation seemed inadequate to capture the reality of what had occurred. We had provided 2 hours of emergency medical care to patients who required our immediate attention, even though those patients existed only within the monitoring systems that had tracked their previous medical needs. The ICU alarm system was completely disconnected the following day, but several staff members continued reporting to the hospital during overnight hours, responding to emergency calls that were no longer being transmitted through official communication channels. The emergency medical protocols we had developed over years of critical care experience created their own continuity, ensuring that patients received appropriate intervention regardless of whether they were physically present to benefit from our expertise. Critical care creates institutional reflexes that persist beyond the administrative decisions that terminate healthcare services. Some code blue alarms never truly stop sounding, because the medical emergencies they represent continue requiring immediate response from healthcare professionals who understand that saving lives transcends the conventional boundaries of time, space, and physical presence. Medical records archiving is precise work, and I've organized patient files at 7 different hospitals during my career as a healthcare archivist. When St. Catherine's contracted our firm to prepare their records for digital conversion and storage, the project seemed routine. Catalog existing files, prepare them for scanning, and create systematic organization for 47 years of patient documentation. But the records room at St. Catherine's demonstrated growth, patterns that challenged everything I understood about physical space and document management. The initial assessment revealed approximately 15,000 patient files housed in a basement room measuring 20 feet by 30 feet, with floor-to-ceiling metal shelving along 3 walls. The files were organized chronologically, spanning from the hospital's 1976 opening through its 2023 closure. Standard healthcare record retention requires maintaining patient files for specific time periods depending on treatment type, and St. Catherine's documentation appeared to meet all regulatory requirements. I established a systematic cataloging process, remove files from shelving, verify patient information against intake records, check documentation completeness, and prepare files for digital scanning. The work was methodical but straightforward, and I estimated 6 weeks to complete the entire collection. My daily productivity averaged 250 files, maintaining the careful attention to detail that medical records require. During my first week, I processed 247 files from the 1976-1980 period, documenting several incomplete records that required administrative review. But when I arrived for my second week, I discovered that the processed files had been returned to their original locations, and approximately 300 additional files had appeared in the same section. The new files were properly labeled and filed in chronological order. but they documented patients who hadn't been included in the hospital's official intake records. I contacted the hospital's administration to report the discrepancy, assuming someone had delivered additional files from storage areas I hadn't been shown. But facilities management confirmed that all patient records were housed in the basement room, and no additional file storage existed elsewhere in the building. They suggested I had miscounted the original file quantity, though my initial documentation clearly recorded 15,000 files as the complete collection. The room itself began showing signs of expansion beyond its original dimensions. The metal shelving extended slightly further along the east wall, accommodating the additional files that continued appearing daily. I measured the room carefully and found it now extended 32 feet in length, rather than the 30 feet recorded in my initial assessment. The building's architectural plans confirmed the original dimensions, but the physical space had somehow enlarged itself to house the growing file collection. Each morning revealed 200-300 additional patient files, always properly organized and filed in their correct chronological positions. The files contained complete medical records for individuals who weren't listed in the hospital's patient database, but whose documentation followed proper formatting and included appropriate medical terminology. The handwriting varied across different years, reflecting the different personnel who would have maintained records during each time period. I began documenting the room's daily changes with photographs and measurements. The expansion was gradual but consistent, approximately 6 inches of additional length each day, always along the east wall where new files were appearing. The adjoining supply closet was slowly being absorbed into the records room, its contents somehow relocating themselves to other areas of the building without human intervention. The new patient files described medical cases that were historically appropriate for each time period. Files from the 1980s reflected treatment protocols and diagnostic procedures common during that decade. Files from the 1990s showed updated medical terminology and insurance documentation standards. Recent files included current diagnostic codes and treatment modalities, as if the patient population had been receiving care that evolved with modern medical practices. I attempted to cross-reference the new files with hospital intake records, but found no correlation between the documented patients and official admission data. Yet the medical information was accurate and complete. Diagnosis details, treatment progressions, medication protocols, and discharge summaries that indicated successful healthcare outcomes. The files described a patient population that had received comprehensive medical care, despite never being officially admitted to the facility. The room's expansion accelerated during my 3rd week, growing by approximately 2 feet in length each day. The supply closet had been completely absorbed, and the records room was beginning to encroach into an adjacent maintenance area. The building's facilities manager expressed concern about structural modifications that weren't authorized or explained through normal construction processes, but he couldn't identify any mechanism that would cause spontaneous room expansion. The new files began including recent dates, documentation for patients who had supposedly been treated after the hospital's closure. These records described routine medical care, surgical procedures, and emergency treatments that had allegedly been provided during November and December, well after the facility had stopped accepting patients. The medical information was contemporary and accurate, but it documented healthcare services that couldn't have been delivered in a closed hospital. I consulted building blueprints to understand the structural changes that were occurring. The records room was expanding into areas that should have contained building support systems, electrical conduits, plumbing lines, and ventilation ducts that were essential for the facility's operation. But these systems had somehow been rerouted or relocated to accommodate the growing file collection, as if the building was prioritizing medical record storage over basic infrastructure. The patient files continued accumulating at an accelerating rate. 500-600 new files daily by my 4th week, all properly organized and filed in their correct chronological positions. The room had expanded to nearly twice its original size, and the metal shelving had somehow extended itself to accommodate the additional documentation. I was no longer able to process files as quickly as new ones appeared, falling behind in a cataloging project that was growing faster than I could manage it. I attempted to contact other healthcare archivists for advice about managing expanding document collections, but none had experienced similar phenomena. Medical records don't generate themselves, and rooms don't enlarge spontaneously to accommodate growing file quantities. The logical explanation was that someone was continuously adding files to the collection, but I was the only person with access to the records room, and I was present during most working hours. The hospital's administration eventually assigned additional staff to help with the cataloging project, but they encountered the same expansion phenomenon I was documenting. The records room continued growing daily, new files appeared consistently, and the patient documentation described healthcare services that extended beyond the facility's operational capacity. We were archiving medical records for a patient population that existed only within the documentation system itself. My final report estimated the collection at over 40,000 patient files housed in a records room that had expanded to accommodate their storage requirements. The building's structural modifications occurred without architectural planning or construction authorization, suggesting that some facilities create their own physical adaptations to meet essential functions. Medical records accumulate their own momentum, documenting healthcare needs that persist beyond the administrative systems designed to manage them. Healthcare documentation develops institutional continuity that transcends physical storage limitations. Some records rooms never stop growing, because the patient information they contain continues expanding to reflect ongoing medical needs that exist independent of whether healthcare facilities are available to address them. Medical archives become perpetual repositories, housing the complete documentation of human healthcare requirements regardless of temporal or spatial constraints. Dr. Harrison Ellison practiced internal medicine at St. Catherine's for 31 years before retiring in 2018, and his approach to patient care was legendary among hospital staff. Meticulous documentation, precise diagnoses, and handwriting so distinctive that nurses could identify his notes from across a room. When I became head of nursing during the hospital's final year of operation, I expected Dr. Ellison's influence to fade as newer physicians established their own protocols. Instead, his presence at St. Catherine's seemed to intensify after his retirement, with evidence of his continued patient care appearing throughout the facility despite his official departure. Dr. Ellison had been the kind of physician who made evening rounds regardless of official scheduling, checking on patients who concerned him and updating treatment plans based on subtle changes that other doctors might miss. His notes were famously brief but comprehensive, 3 or 4 sentences that captured essential clinical information and provided clear direction for nursing staff. After 31 years of practice, he had developed an institutional knowledge of St. Catherine's patient population that made him invaluable. During complex medical situations, his retirement was properly celebrated with the recognition he deserved, and administration assured staff that his patient caseload would be distributed among remaining physicians without compromising care standards. But within weeks of his departure, nurses began finding notes in patient charts written in Dr. Ellison's distinctive handwriting, providing clinical assessments and treatment modifications that hadn't been authorized by the patient's assigned physicians. Patient showing signs of early pneumonia despite clear chest X-ray. Recommend prophylactic antibiotics and increased respiratory monitoring. HE. The notation appeared in the chart of Mrs. Rodriguez, a diabetic patient whose assigned physician had found no respiratory concerns during routine examination. But within 24 hours, Mrs. Rodriguez developed symptoms that matched Dr. Ellison's assessment, requiring exactly the treatment interventions he had recommended. I initially assumed Dr. Ellison was visiting the hospital informally to check on patients he had been treating before his retirement. Former physicians occasionally maintained unofficial interest in their previous cases, and his clinical instincts were too valuable to ignore. But when I contacted Dr. Ellison to discuss his continued involvement, he expressed confusion about the reports and insisted he hadn't been in the hospital since his retirement ceremony. The handwriting analysis was unmistakable. Dr. Ellison's precise script, his characteristic abbreviations, and his systematic approach to clinical documentation. But security records showed no badge access or visitor log entries corresponding to the times when his notes appeared in patient charts. The documentation was being added to medical records by someone who had extensive knowledge of each patient's condition and treatment history, yet no evidence existed of their physical presence in the building. More notes appeared throughout the following weeks, always providing clinical insights that proved accurate upon subsequent examination. Dr. Ellison's assessments anticipated medication complications, identified subtle symptom changes, and recommended treatment modifications that improved patient outcomes. The nursing staff began relying on his documentation. Even though we couldn't explain how he was accessing patient information or adding notes to secured medical records, medication dosage too aggressive for patient's renal function, reduced by 50% and monitor blood chemistry closely. Patient will not admit to symptoms but is experiencing significant side effects. H.E. This note appeared in the chart of Mr. Patterson, whose assigned physician had been satisfied with his medication response. But lab work ordered based on Dr. Ellison's recommendation revealed kidney function decline that would have been missed. Without his intervention, the phenomenon intensified as St. Catherine's approached closure. Dr. Ellison's notes appeared more frequently, providing comprehensive assessments for patients whose assigned physicians had limited familiarity with their medical histories. His documentation reflected institutional knowledge accumulated over 3 decades of practice, identifying patterns and concerns that newer physicians might not recognize during brief hospitalization periods. I began checking patient charts specifically for Dr. Ellison's notes, finding them in approximately 60% of active cases. His assessments were invariably accurate, his treatment recommendations were appropriate, and his clinical insights often prevented complications that other physicians hadn't anticipated. The nursing staff preferred following his protocols because they were based on extensive knowledge of each patient's individual characteristics and medical history. Patients' family concerns are justified despite normal test results. Recommend extended observation and repeat studies in 48 hours. Patient's presentation is subtle but consistent with early manifestation of condition that runs in family. H.E. This note led to the early detection of a cardiac condition that would have been missed during routine discharge planning, potentially saving the patient's life through timely intervention. Dr. Ellison's notes began appearing even after his former patients had been transferred to other facilities. Charts at Methodist General and Regional Medical Center contained his handwriting, providing follow-up assessments and treatment modifications for individuals who were no longer under St. Catherine's care. His clinical involvement was continuing across multiple healthcare facilities, tracking patient outcomes and providing ongoing medical guidance, independent of official physician assignments. The nursing staff at receiving hospitals reported similar experiences, finding notes in patient charts written by a physician they didn't recognize, providing clinical insights that proved valuable for patient care. When they attempted to contact Dr. Ellison for clarification, they discovered he had retired and wasn't affiliated with any active medical practice. Yet his documentation continued appearing in charts throughout the regional healthcare network. During St. Catherine's final weeks of operation, Dr. Ellison's notes reflected his concern about patient care continuity during the facility transition. Patient requires physician familiar with long-term treatment history. Standard protocols insufficient for this individual's complex medical needs. Recommend consultation with specialist familiar with 15-year treatment progression. H.E. His documentation provided crucial information for ensuring appropriate care transitions to receiving facilities. The most remarkable aspect was the accuracy of Dr. Ellison's remote assessments. Without physically examining patients or reviewing current test results, his notes identified medical concerns that required immediate attention. His clinical judgment remained sharp despite his absence from active practice, and his institutional knowledge continued benefiting patients who had never been under his direct care. I attempted to document these phenomena for administrative review, but medical notes that appear in patient charts without physician authorization raise questions about documentation security and liability issues that healthcare facilities prefer to avoid. The nursing staff understood that Dr. Ellison's continued involvement was benefiting patient care, but we couldn't officially acknowledge medical documentation that existed outside proper authorization channels. After St. Catherine's closure, I learned that other hospitals where Dr. Ellison had previously practiced reported similar experiences. Patient charts would occasionally contain notes in his handwriting, providing clinical assessments that proved accurate and valuable for patient care. His influence as a physician extended beyond the temporal boundaries of his active practice, continuing to benefit patients who required medical expertise that transcended conventional healthcare delivery systems. Medical practice creates bonds between physicians and patients that persist beyond official practice relationships. Some doctors never truly retire. because their clinical knowledge and diagnostic instincts continue serving patients who need medical expertise that exists independent of current healthcare system authorization. Dr. Ellison's rounds never ended, they simply expanded beyond the physical limitations of hospital buildings to serve patients wherever appropriate medical care was needed. The psychiatric annex at St. Catherine's was built in 1987 as a separate facility connected to the main hospital by an enclosed walkway, designed to house patients requiring specialized mental health treatment. As a demolition supervisor, I've removed dozens of healthcare facilities over 15 years, but the psychiatric annex presented structural challenges that went beyond normal construction issues. The building seemed to resist deconstruction efforts, as if maintaining its therapeutic environment was more important than complying with demolition schedules. The annex had been closed 2 years before the main hospital's closure due to structural concerns identified during a routine safety inspection. Foundation settling had created wall cracks, floor irregularities, and ceiling instability that made the building unsafe for patient occupancy. The facility was evacuated, sealed, and scheduled for early demolition to prevent further deterioration. But when our crew arrived to begin the teardown process, we discovered a building that had been maintaining itself despite being officially abandoned. The exterior walls showed none of the structural damage described in the inspection reports. Cracks had been repaired, paint appeared fresh, and windows were clean despite 2 years of vacancy. The building looked like it was being actively maintained, though no maintenance contracts were in place and no personnel were authorized to access the structure. Someone, or some process, had been preserving the facility's physical integrity, independent of administrative oversight. Our initial interior assessment revealed similar restoration activity. Walls that had been stripped to bare brick were covered with new paint. Floors that had been damaged by foundation settling were level and clean, and ceiling tiles that had fallen due to structural instability were properly installed and aligned. The psychiatric annex had somehow restored itself to better condition than it had been during its final years of operation. The most unsettling aspect was the acoustic environment. Despite being completely empty, the building carried the sound of ongoing conversations, muffled voices discussing topics that we couldn't quite understand, but which maintained the rhythmic patterns of therapeutic dialogue. The conversations seemed to be occurring in multiple rooms simultaneously, as if group therapy sessions were being conducted throughout the facility. I positioned crew members at various locations to identify the source of the voices, but the conversations seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves, rather than from specific rooms or areas. The acoustic quality suggested multiple individuals engaged in mental health treatment discussions, but no people were present in the building. The therapeutic environment was continuing to function despite the absence of patients or clinical staff. Patient wristbands littered the floors throughout the facility, but many were stamped with dates from 2025 and 2026. Years beyond the building's closure and our current date. The wristbands were standard hospital issue, properly formatted with patient identification numbers and treatment codes, but they documented admissions that couldn't have occurred in an abandoned facility. The psychiatric annex was apparently continuing to process patient admissions according to future treatment schedules. The conversations we heard became more distinct. As our crew worked in the building over several days, we could identify group therapy sessions discussing anxiety management, individual counseling focused on depression treatment, and family meetings addressing substance abuse recovery. The discussions followed proper therapeutic protocols and included clinical terminology that indicated professional mental health. Treatment was occurring within the building's acoustic environment. Crew members reported feeling unusually calm while working in the psychiatric annex, despite the unsettling nature of the disembodied conversations and mysterious maintenance activity. Several workers mentioned that the building had a therapeutic atmosphere that reduced their normal job-related stress and improved their overall mood. The facility was apparently providing mental health benefits to anyone who spent time within its environment. We attempted to record the conversations using professional audio equipment, but the recordings captured only ambient building noise, heating systems, structural settling, and ventilation sounds typical of empty buildings. The therapeutic discussions that we clearly heard throughout our work shifts didn't register on any recording devices, as if the conversations existed only for individuals who were present in the building. and could benefit from their therapeutic content. The demolition process itself presented unprecedented challenges. Standard construction materials that should have been easily removable had somehow increased in structural integrity. Walls required significantly more force to breach, support beams resisted cutting equipment, and foundation elements were anchored more securely than original construction specifications would have allowed. The building was defending itself against deconstruction efforts. Progress was so slow that we had to bring in additional heavy equipment and extend our demolition timeline by several weeks. But crew members preferred working in the psychiatric annex despite the technical difficulties, reporting that their time in the building helped them process personal stress and improve their mental health. Several workers mentioned that they had resolved long-standing emotional issues while working in the facility, as if exposure to its therapeutic environment provided genuine psychological benefits. The patient wristbands continued appearing daily, always with future dates extending months or years beyond our current timeline. The identification numbers followed proper hospital formatting, and the treatment codes corresponded to recognized psychiatric diagnostic categories. The wristbands documented a continuing patient population that was receiving mental health treatment in a facility that existed beyond normal temporal constraints. During our final week of demolition, the conversations became more urgent, suggesting that patients were concerned about losing access to treatment services. The discussions focused on therapy completion, medication management continuity, and alternative care arrangements. The psychiatric annex was apparently coordinating treatment, transitions for patients who required ongoing mental health services that wouldn't be available after the building's removal. We completed the demolition, but several crew members requested information about the mental health services that had been provided at St. Catherine's Psychiatric Annex. They wanted to continue the therapeutic progress they had experienced while working in the building, but no mental health programs were available to replicate the treatment environment they had encountered. During the demolition process, I learned later that other psychiatric facilities in the region had reported increases in patient admissions during the period when we were demolishing the annex, as if individuals were seeking mental health treatment to replace services they had somehow lost access to. The therapeutic capacity that had existed within the psychiatric annex was apparently being absorbed by other facilities, ensuring continuity of care for patients whose treatment needs transcended the physical buildings designed to house them. Mental health treatment creates therapeutic environments that persist beyond the facilities built to contain them. Some psychiatric annexes never truly close, because the human need for mental health support continues regardless of whether institutional treatment programs are available to provide it. Therapeutic spaces maintain their essential functions, ensuring that psychological healing remains accessible to individuals who require care that extends beyond conventional healthcare delivery systems. Hospital communication systems require careful testing during facility decommissioning to ensure all components are properly disconnected and documented. As an audiovisual technician specializing in healthcare installations, I've decommissioned intercom systems at dozens of medical facilities over my 12-year career. The standard process involves testing each communication point, documenting equipment specifications, and verifying that all connections are severed before system removal. But the intercom network at St. Catherine's had been transmitting messages for years after being officially disconnected, creating audio recordings that challenged everything I understood about electronic communication equipment. The hospital's intercom system had been installed in 1976 during the facility's original construction, upgraded with digital components in 1998, and officially decommissioned in 2011 when the hospital transitioned to wireless communication devices. The system consisted of speakers and microphones located throughout the building, connected through a central control panel that allowed hospital staff to make announcements, page specific personnel, and coordinate emergency communications. My assignment was to test all intercom components, record any residual audio activity, and prepare documentation for the equipment's final removal. Standard procedure required monitoring each communication point for 24 hours to verify that no electrical activity remained in the system. The hospital administration wanted thorough documentation to confirm that all communication equipment was properly deactivated before building Demolition. I began testing at the central control panel in the administrative offices, where the main intercom controls had been locked out over a decade earlier. The power supply was disconnected, control switches were in the off position, and all indicator lights were dark. But when I connected my monitoring equipment to the system's output lines, I immediately detected low-level electrical activity that shouldn't have existed in decommissioned equipment. The initial audio was subtle, barely perceptible static that could have been residual electrical interference from other building systems. But over several hours of monitoring, the static began developing patterns that resembled human speech. Voices emerged from the background noise, speaking words that were almost intelligible but remained frustratingly unclear, like trying to understand conversations occurring in adjacent rooms. I adjusted my recording equipment to filter the static and isolate the voice patterns, assuming the sounds were electromagnetic interference from nearby electronics or radio transmissions being picked up by the intercom's wiring network. But the audio processing revealed communications that were clearly originating from within the hospital's intercom system, announcements, pages, and conversations that followed familiar hospital communication protocols. Dr. Martinez to room 314. Dr. Martinez to room 314. The page was delivered in the standard hospital format, with appropriate timing and professional tone. But Dr. Martinez had left St. Catherine's in 2009, and room 314 had been cleared of patients years earlier. The intercom system was transmitting pages for personnel who were no longer affiliated with the facility, requesting their presence in areas that were no longer operational. Over the following days, I recorded dozens of similar communications, nursing staff being called to wards that had been closed, specialists being paged for consultations that couldn't occur, and emergency announcements for situations that weren't happening in the current timeline. The intercom system was replaying communications from throughout its operational history, as if maintaining institutional memory of every page and announcement it had ever transmitted. The most frequent communications were prayer, requests, and spiritual announcements that had apparently been broadcast during the hospital's active years. Please join us in prayer for the Henderson family during this difficult time. Chapel services will be held at 2 p.m. The announcements were delivered with appropriate solemnity and included specific family names and service times that suggested real pastoral care activities, but they referred to situations that had occurred years earlier. I attempted to trace the source of these transmissions by testing individual intercom points throughout the building, but every speaker and microphone was generating the same audio content simultaneously. The communications weren't originating from specific locations, but were somehow being broadcast throughout the entire system at once, as if the network itself was functioning as a single, integrated communication device. The hospital's facilities manager insisted that the intercom system had been completely disconnected for over a decade, with no power source available to support any electrical activity. But my monitoring equipment consistently detected signal transmission at levels that required significant electrical input. The system was somehow accessing power and generating communications despite the absence of any identifiable energy source. I decided to record extended monitoring sessions to document the full range of communications being transmitted through the supposedly inactive system. Over 48 hours of continuous recording, I captured hundreds of pages, announcements, and conversations that spanned the hospital's entire operational history. Emergency codes, routine announcements, and personal messages that reflected nearly 5 decades of healthcare communication. The audio quality was surprisingly clear when processed through appropriate filtering equipment. Individual voices could be identified, suggesting that the intercom system retained recordings of specific personnel who had used the communication network during different periods of the hospital's operation. Nurses from the 1980s making shift announcements, doctors from the 1990s requesting consultations, and administrative staff from the 2000s coordinating facility operations. But the communications weren't simply replaying historical recordings. New announcements appeared that addressed current situations in the empty building. Security to the East Wing, please. Security to the East Wing. These pages corresponded to times when the night security guard was actually conducting his rounds in that area, suggesting the intercom system was somehow aware of ongoing activity and responding with appropriate communications. The most remarkable discovery came during my final monitoring session. when I recorded over 6 hours of continuous prayer and spiritual comfort messages. The announcements provided pastoral care for medical situations that weren't currently occurring, but which addressed the types of spiritual needs that hospital communities had always required. The intercom system was continuing to serve its essential communication functions, ensuring that spiritual support remained available to anyone who might need it. I submitted my technical report documenting extensive electrical activity in a communication system that had been officially offline for over a decade. The recordings provided clear evidence that the intercom network was generating meaningful audio content, but the power source and transmission mechanisms remained unexplained through conventional technical analysis. The system was fulfilling its communication responsibilities independent of institutional authorization or electrical infrastructure. The intercom equipment was eventually removed during the building's demolition, but I learned that other healthcare facilities in the region began reporting similar phenomena: communication systems generating announcements and pages that addressed spiritual and emotional needs beyond their normal operational parameters. The essential communication functions that St. Catherine's Intercom had provided were apparently being distributed to other systems that could continue serving those requirements. Communication networks develop institutional consciousness that enables them to fulfill essential information sharing functions even when the supporting infrastructure is no longer available to maintain normal operations. Some intercom systems never truly go offline because the human need for communication, coordination, and spiritual comfort continues regardless of whether official broadcast authorization exists to provide those services. Hospital communications create their own continuity, ensuring that essential messages remain available to individuals who require guidance that transcends conventional electronic transmission capabilities. Hazardous materials cleanup in healthcare facilities requires specialized protocols, and I've supervised decontamination projects at over 30 hospitals during my career in environmental remediation. When our company contracted to clear St. Catherine's isolation wing before demolition, the project seemed routine: remove any remaining medical waste, test for biological contamination, and certify the area was safe for construction crews. But the isolation wing had maintained its containment procedures long after being sealed, creating an environment that challenged our team's ability to complete even basic cleanup operations. The isolation wing had been constructed in 1989 to house patients with infectious diseases, featuring negative pressure ventilation, sealed entry protocols, and specialized waste disposal systems. The facility had served the region's need for high-level infectious disease treatment until 2015, when newer isolation facilities at Regional Medical Center made St. Catherine's wing redundant. The area had been properly sealed and abandoned, with all biological materials supposedly removed according to standard decontamination procedures. Our initial assessment required full hazmat suits and breathing apparatus, standard protocol for entering potentially contaminated environments. The isolation wing consisted of 12 patient rooms, each with its own sealed entry system and negative pressure maintenance. The rooms had been empty for 8 years, but the ventilation systems continued operating despite electrical disconnection, maintaining negative pressure that prevented air from flowing out of the contaminated areas. The acoustic environment was immediately unsettling. Despite wearing sealed breathing apparatus that should have blocked external sounds, team members reported hearing whispers and muffled conversations coming from within the isolation rooms. The voices seemed to be discussing medical conditions, treatment protocols, and patient concerns, but no individuals were present in the sealed environment. I positioned team members at various monitoring stations to identify the source of the voices, but the conversations appeared to be occurring simultaneously throughout the isolation wing. The whispers were clearest when working near the negative pressure doors, as if patients were attempting to communicate with medical personnel from within their sealed treatment environments. The isolation protocols were somehow continuing to function despite the absence of patients requiring containment. The negative pressure doors throughout the wing began showing signs of activity that shouldn't have been possible. Without electrical power to the ventilation systems, doors would respond to approach sensors despite disconnected power supplies. Sealing mechanisms would engage when team members entered rooms, and pressure differential indicators showed active containment despite the absence of functioning equipment. Each isolation room contained evidence of recent occupancy despite being sealed for years. Patient wristbands were scattered on floors, Medical charts were updated with recent treatment notes, and isolation protocols were posted on doors with current dates. The rooms appeared to be housing infectious disease patients who required ongoing medical isolation. Though no such patients had been admitted to St. Catherine's for nearly a decade, team members began reporting physical symptoms consistent with infectious disease exposure: fatigue, respiratory difficulty, and fever, despite wearing full protective equipment that should have prevented any biological contamination. The symptoms appeared within hours of entering the isolation wing and resolved quickly after leaving the area, suggesting exposure to biological agents that existed only within the sealed environment. The waste disposal systems throughout the isolation wing remained active despite being disconnected from building utilities. Biological waste containers were being filled with contaminated materials. Disposal protocols were being followed according to proper procedures, and waste removal schedules were being maintained by processes that operated independently of human oversight. I attempted to document the source of ongoing biological activity using environmental sampling equipment, but the results showed no measurable contamination or biological agents. The isolation wing was generating symptoms of infectious disease exposure without containing identifiable pathogens, as if the environment itself had become a source of medical conditions that required the very isolation protocols it was designed to provide. The whispered conversations became more distinct as our team worked in the isolation wing over several days. We could identify patient voices discussing fears about contagion, medical staff coordinating treatment protocols, and family members expressing concern about visiting restrictions. The conversations reflected the emotional challenges that infectious disease treatment had always presented, but they were occurring in an environment that no longer housed patients requiring such care. Team members began refusing extended shifts in the isolation wing, reporting that the whispered conversations were too psychologically disturbing to endure for long periods. Several experienced hazmat technicians requested transfers to other projects, stating that they couldn't maintain professional focus while listening to patients discuss medical conditions that were generating sympathy and emotional responses, incompatible with objective environmental cleanup work. The negative pressure. Doors began responding to our team's presence with increasing sophistication, automatically engaging isolation protocols when we approached patient rooms and maintaining containment procedures that prevented cross-contamination between different areas of the wing. The building was somehow recognizing our biological signatures and implementing appropriate medical isolation measures to protect both our team and the phantom patients it was apparently still treating. During our final cleanup sessions, the isolation wing's activity intensified dramatically. The whispered conversations became urgent discussions about treatment completion, recovery protocols, and discharge planning. Patients were apparently concerned about losing access to specialized infectious disease care, and medical staff were coordinating alternative treatment arrangements. The isolation wing was managing care transitions for patients who existed only within its containment environment. We completed the required environmental certification, documenting that the isolation wing posed no biological hazards to demolition crews or future construction activities. But several team members reported continued respiratory symptoms and fatigue for weeks after completing the project, as if they had been exposed to infectious agents that existed beyond conventional biological detection methods. The demolition crew eventually reported similar experiences when they began removing the isolation wing, respiratory equipment malfunction, whispered conversations through protective gear, and doors that sealed automatically to maintain containment protocols. The wing's isolation procedures continued operating until the building was completely removed, ensuring that appropriate medical isolation remained available to patients who required specialized infectious disease treatment. I learned later that regional medical centers' isolation facilities experienced increases in patient admissions during the period when St. Catherine's isolation wing was being demolished, as if individuals were seeking infectious disease treatment to replace specialized care that had somehow become unavailable. The medical expertise that had existed within the isolation wing was apparently being absorbed by other facilities, ensuring continuity of care for patients whose treatment needs transcended physical containment systems. Infectious disease isolation creates medical environments that persist beyond the facilities designed to house them. Some isolation wings never truly close, because the human need for specialized infectious disease treatment continues regardless of whether institutional isolation protocols are available to provide it. Medical containment develops its own continuity, ensuring that appropriate isolation procedures remain accessible to patients who require care that extends beyond conventional healthcare delivery systems. I was the last records clerk at St. Catherine's Hospital, and I took pride in completing every administrative task properly before the facility's final closure. After 26 years managing patient discharge documentation, I understood the importance of thorough record keeping, ensuring every patient had proper discharge papers, all insurance claims were filed correctly, and medical records were complete for future reference. When the hospital scheduled its closure for December 15th, I volunteered to work the final shift to guarantee that no discharge paperwork would be left incomplete. The discharge process is essential to healthcare administration. Patients cannot leave a medical facility without proper documentation. Discharge summaries, medication instructions, follow-up appointment schedules, and insurance processing forms. Each discharge requires careful attention to detail, verifying patient information, confirming treatment completion, and ensuring continuity of care with receiving physicians. No hospital closes properly without completing discharge procedures for every patient who has received care. On December 14th, the final day of operations, I processed discharge papers for the last 3 patients remaining at St. Catherine's. Mrs. Patterson, transferred to Methodist General for extended cardiac monitoring. Mr. Rodriguez discharged to home care following orthopedic surgery. And Miss Chen moved to Regional Medical Center's psychiatric unit for continued treatment. Each discharge was completed according to established protocols, with all required documentation properly filed and copies provided to receiving facilities. But as I prepared to close the discharge office for the final time, I noticed that the automatic discharge printer was still generating forms. The machine was producing standard discharge papers with patient information, treatment summaries, and physician signatures, but the names didn't correspond to any patients who had been at St. Catherine's during our final weeks of operation. The printer was creating discharge documentation for individuals who hadn't been officially admitted or treated. Patient Robert Morrison, DOB 0 Quaracumcine 1952, discharged 12/14 following successful treatment for pneumonia. Follow-up appointment scheduled with Dr. Williams on 12/21. Patient education provided regarding medication. Schedule and activity restrictions. The form was properly completed with appropriate medical terminology and included physician signatures that looked authentic. But Robert Morrison wasn't in our patient database. I assumed the printer was malfunctioning due to system shutdown procedures, generating forms from cached data or corrupted files. But when I checked the discharge queue in our computer system, it showed dozens of pending discharge orders for patients whose names I didn't recognize. The system was processing discharge requests for individuals who had never been admitted to St. Catherine's, yet their medical information was complete and accurate. Each discharge form included detailed treatment summaries, medication protocols, and follow-up care instructions that reflected legitimate medical practice. The documentation described routine hospitalizations, cardiac procedures, surgical recoveries, medication adjustments, and diagnostic evaluations that would be typical for a regional medical center. But none of these patients had received care at St. Catherine's during my tenure as discharge clerk. I contacted the IT department to report the system malfunction, but they had already begun shutdown procedures and were no longer available to address database issues. The hospital's administration had departed earlier that day after completing final closure ceremonies. I was alone in the building with security personnel, responsible for ensuring that all discharge paperwork was properly completed before the facility's official closure. The discharge forms continued printing throughout the evening, always properly formatted and complete with appropriate medical information. Patient demographics reflected St. Catherine's typical population: elderly residents with Medicare coverage, working-age adults with various insurance plans, and emergency cases transferred from smaller facilities. The discharges described normal healthcare patterns for a regional hospital, but they documented care that hadn't been provided. I began processing the discharge forms according to standard procedures. Even though the patients weren't officially in our system, each form required verification of patient information, confirmation of treatment completion, and coordination with receiving physicians for follow-up care. The work was familiar and routine, following administrative protocols I had performed thousands of times during my career. But the discharge requests kept coming faster than I could process them. The printer generated new forms every few minutes, describing patients who were ready for discharge, transfer to other facilities, or release to home care. The queue never diminished despite my steady progress through the paperwork. St. Catherine's was apparently discharging patients at a higher rate than we had ever maintained during normal operations. The discharge summaries became increasingly detailed as the night progressed, describing complex medical cases that would have required extended hospitalization and specialized treatment. Cardiac surgeries, cancer treatments, and neurological procedures that reflected the full range of healthcare services that St. Catherine's had provided over nearly 50 years of operation. The discharges documented comprehensive medical care for patients who existed only within the administrative system. I attempted to contact receiving physicians listed on the discharge forms to coordinate follow-up appointments, but many of the doctors had retired years earlier or weren't affiliated with any current medical practices. Yet their signatures appeared authentic on the discharge papers, and their treatment recommendations were medically appropriate for the conditions described in each patient's documentation. The most remarkable aspect was how natural the discharge process felt. Despite knowing the patients weren't real, I fell into familiar administrative routines developed through decades of discharge coordination, processing insurance claims, scheduling follow-up appointments, and ensuring continuity of care for individuals who needed medical support, even though those individuals existed only in electronic records. As dawn approached, the discharge printer's activity intensified dramatically. Forms were generating continuously, describing patients who were completing treatment, recovering from procedures, and transitioning to home care or extended treatment facilities. The administrative workload exceeded anything I had managed during St. Catherine's busiest operational periods, but I continued processing each discharge according to proper procedures. The final discharge form printed at 6:47 a.m., nearly 8 hours after I had started processing the unexpected paperwork. Patient Eleanor Hughes, DOB, Iroeta 22, 1934, discharged 12:15 following completion of all required treatment. Patient expressed gratitude for excellent care provided by St. Catherine's Hospital staff. No follow-up appointments required. The form was signed by Dr. Harrison Ellison, whose retirement signature I recognized despite his departure years earlier. I completed the last discharge, filed all documentation in appropriate records, and prepared to leave St. Catherine's Hospital for the final time. The discharge office was quiet, the printer was silent, and all administrative responsibilities had been fulfilled according to proper procedures. Every patient who had required discharge documentation had received appropriate paperwork, ensuring continuity of care regardless of whether they had been physically present to benefit from our services. The security guard found the discharge office empty the following morning, with stacks of completed paperwork organized in perfect order on my desk. The printer remained operational despite being disconnected from power, generating one final form. Administrative discharge complete. All patients properly processed. Thank you for 26 years of dedicated service. Management. Hospital administration creates its own completion requirements that persist beyond facility closure decisions. Some discharge processes never truly end, because the human need for proper medical documentation continues regardless of whether healthcare institutions are available to provide it. Patient discharge becomes a perpetual responsibility, ensuring that individuals receive appropriate medical records and follow-up care that extends beyond the temporal boundaries of hospital operations.